My name is Galen. I am the author here at the Homefront. And today, guys, I am so happy to be joined by Evelyn Quartz. Evelyn, welcome.
Thank you, Reed. Thanks so much for having me.
And guys, Evelyn is an incredibly talented writer and thinker that I am just getting to know, but you all should definitely know. I hope that you will subscribe to her Substack, Quartz Evelyn, and read what she's got to say. Evelyn has a background in Capitol Hill in communications, and she has left Washington D.C. for greener pastures, and I can certainly not blame her for that. All right,
Yep.
so today, Evelyn, we are talking about messaging and specifically around the idea of why the only pro democracy party we have left, the Democrats, have such a hard time with it. And I have plenty of thoughts that I've shared over the years, but I want to open the discussion with something that comes from Charlotte Alter's new article in Time magazine about where the Democrats go from here. And her line says, quote, "Many of these conversations made my head hurt. Democrats kept presenting cliches as insights and old ideas as new ideas. Everybody said the same things. Nobody seemed to be really saying anything at all. But in between feeble platitudes about, quote, showing up and listening and, quote, fighting for the working class and, quote, meeting people where they are, a few common threads emerged." So that is something that I think you and I have been sort of talking about, messaging about, trading articles about in the last few weeks, which is the problem is that too many people, I think, in the Democratic leadership or the Democratic superstructure see messaging as a thing in and of itself rather than an endpoint of a lot of other work. So give us your sense of what you think's going on.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So for me, I would say that it's a much different kind of democracy issue than you're used to hearing. So I don't think I think the idea that it's a messaging problem is insane, and we'll get into that. I think it's a problem of political legitimacy. So you have this philosopher, he's called John Gray, and he talks about sort of this crisis of legitimacy that America would have been facing regardless of who had won the 2024 election, right? So you say Harris had won, you'd have what, maybe like a third of the electorate or more who would not have accepted her as a legitimate president, right? And
Hmm.
then you have essentially the same problem with Trump winning. The liberals, they're not going to say, oh, he's not democratically elected, but they're not going to accept him as a president that's going to do any good for them. So you have this breakdown of cohesion that a liberal democracy depends upon to thrive, right? You need a sense of legitimacy. You need some sort of idea of like a national project that we don't have. So I think that's the real kind of crisis of democracy. Um, this idea that like we're supposed to have this shared understanding of what our politics are for. There's not a lot of answers for that. And then you have these two camps that cannot are living in different worlds, right? So you can't speak to them. And I think the problem with the Democrats is they're so set on this idea that just squeaking by in the next election by kind of assuming that this pendulum will just swing back to them. Um, it ignores the structural problems of legitimacy that could actually, if someone wanted to address that, could bring along more of the electorate, right? And you would actually have someone who's looking to solve this bigger problem. Otherwise, we're just talking like surface level stuff, and it doesn't work, in my opinion. And so that's what I write about. That's kind of what the thread that I'm interested in here.
Yeah, and I think that's what we've seen. That's what I've seen over the almost 6 years that I've been fighting alongside Democrats, which is it's enough to just not be Donald Trump.
Yeah,
And that just barely worked in 2020. But I think the
yeah,
one thing that I think is I'm is sort of thinking back through how we got to this place, Evelyn, is that 2020 was the aberration, right? Not 2016, not
exactly.
2024.
Yeah,
2020 was the aberration, and it only happened because of a confluence of events that literally no one could have imagined,
yeah.
right? No
The
one possibly
pandemic.
could have imagined, which is a global pandemic that in that time kills 500,000 Americans with a uniquely incompetent and buffoonish leader, right? And
Yeah,
even then, it was only what, 11,000 votes in Georgia, 25,000 votes in Wisconsin, and all these other things, right? So it was very, very close.
Yeah.
Then we get sort of lulled into this idea that, okay, maybe the country's coming back to us on the idea of democracy in 2022 because it wasn't as bad as we thought it was. We didn't win, right? We
Yeah.
won in the places, in the state races we needed to win. In the gubernatorial and secretary of state places, but at the federal level we didn't do as badly as we thought we would.
Hmm.
Probably a lot of that on the strength of Roe v. Wade being overturned, as much as anything.
Yeah.
But we could that's
Maybe.
another story. But and then 2024, we see now all these, this book about, Biden, whether or not he was, should have run. I think the answer is no, he shouldn't have. But the other part too is that, like, the issues for the Democratic Party in 2024 started long before 2024.
Right.
And you talk about the legitimacy, and I think that one thing that what I have seen so far with my Democratic friends is that they're either unwilling or incapable of understanding that they have as big a legitimacy problem with their own base
Yeah.
as they do with those soft Republicans or those independent swing voters, that stayed home or held their nose and voted for Trump one more time. Look, I think that if you want to say that there's racism and misogyny in the country, like, okay, that's not new, right? That could appeal to some of the reasons why Kamala Harris lost, but I think that's also, I think, a surface level argument. I think that's eliding really the much deeper issues.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. For me, the problem, and I've written about this, I wrote an article for Compact Magazine about this if you're interested in checking that out. Um, but the problem with this so pro democracy kind of centrist movement is that it frames the debate in this like strict binary, right? Either you're for democracy or you're letting fascism happen. Like Jen Psaki on MSNBC has been saying, like, this is on you, this is on your watch, right? It's this kind of arrogance where they cannot interrogate their policies, the past 40 years of like privatization, financialization that have broken this social contract that we need in
Right.
order to have faith in our government, right? This idea. I have a piece about this too. The social contract that I or you or any of us as voters, as participants in democracy, in exchange for our civic participation and our faith in the system, we need to have the state give assure us that we'll have the material sort of foundations to be able to pursue a good life, right? Affordable housing, healthcare, maybe a pledge that they're going to do something about the climate, paid time off, right? These things have all been gutted. So there's no introspection about what these policies have actually done. And instead, and Reed, we've talked about this, they're going to spend $1 billion on focus groups, and they're going to say, nope, it's a problem of the trusted messenger. We don't have enough trusted messenger. But they fail to consider, right, that maybe people did hear them and they said, no, we don't trust you anymore. So I think this kind of introspection that they're doing is very fake. And to me, it's only going to exacerbate sort of the problem that I've been talking about that no one wants to address, this legitimacy problem. It's only going to make it worse. So you're kicking the can down the road with all this stuff. And that's what makes me really angry. I think that's what kind of inspires me to try to write about this more because a lot of like well-meaning people want to help and they want to be part of this, and they're told that the best way to do that is to kind of go to these like kind of identity resistance based protests that don't actually have any material demands. And it's just this cycle that kind of keeps this class of people in power and doesn't actually question any of it. So that's my critique. But yeah.
No, so there's a couple of things there. Let me start backward. Let me start at the end, and I'll go backwards. So first, on the protest piece. Look, I think if anybody wants to go out and exercise their First Amendment rights to free assembly and free speech, they should do that.
Absolutely.
But we should ask ourselves the question, to what end? And I
Yeah.
think that's the thing that my friends, the Democrats, they have a strategy problem. They have a messaging problem. They have a belief problem. They have all of these things, right? Like, if you have 20,000 people show up in Salt Lake City to see Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, great. Who are those
Right.
people? What
Right.
have you asked them to do since then? Right? Because what's going to happen, to your point about material demands, is that no one's really making material demands. Everybody's complaining, but here's what happens. They came out in April, right? nothing will have changed for the better, right?
Yeah.
Trump will have retreated on a bunch of stuff and zigged and zagged, but that's who he is, right? That's not surprising. That's the state of nature with him. But what happens then is that more and more people see, well, wait a second, I went to this rally, I went to that rally, I wore this hat, I wore this
Yeah.
pin, and nothing changes. And the people I'm demanding change from, right, either can't provide it because they're out of power, won't provide it because they're out of power and they're scared, or are in power in a state someplace, but are afraid of X, Y, or Z. If I do this, then that could happen. And then those people who came out start to get discouraged, which is exactly what the bad guys want, right? And they say, well, none of it matters anyway. I guess they were right. The system is too broken, so why am I going to put my neck on the line? The second piece, or the first piece, depending on how you're looking at it, is the focus group piece. Look, I have participated, I have organized and run more focus groups than I can imagine and I can remember. And for those of you who haven't been on the other side of the glass, right? It's basically a dark room, right, with a bunch of nerds on computers, right, and videotapes and everything else, and everybody's wolfing down bad takeout food, peanut M&Ms, diet cokes, right? Everybody's trying to figure out, okay, there's 12 people in the room, sometimes it's all men, sometimes it's all women, sometimes it's a mix. There's always that one guy, Evelyn, who's going to be the know-it-all, right? And you can spot him 8 seconds after he sits down. He usually sits in the corner, he's got a smug look on his face. They're all looking at the mirror because they know you're back there, but and then you've got the moderator who's trying to keep things online, on track. But let's go to the other side. Let's go into the room. Those people that have come to the focus group facility or the hotel ballroom or whatever, wherever it is you're participating, right? They didn't come there because they were so passionate about sharing their beliefs with you. They showed up because you gave them a couple $100. They passed a screen of, male 38 to 45, Republican, cares about these issues. And they're going to get snacks and everything else. And they're going to get, 2 hours and then they can go home. I look, we did focus groups last summer about this time, or a little, maybe in June or July of last time, um, in Wisconsin. And like it was very clear that like Joe Biden was in trouble. This was before the debate. Like we knew that Biden was in trouble. The Republican men, it didn't matter what we said about Trump. It didn't matter about like they weren't moving off of him, right? Even in the idea of like do it for your daughters, they're like, nope, my I know better than my daughters. And then a lot of the women we talked to also, like they weren't having it either, right? Like it
Yeah.
wasn't necessarily that like they liked Donald Trump, they just weren't going anywhere near the Democrats. Like that's interesting information, that's good to know. But one, it's qualitative, right? It's 12 people in Madison, Wisconsin, or Green Bay, or wherever the hell you are, right?
Yeah.
Secondly, it's information that is useful, but again, doesn't tell me that Evelyn is the best person to do this. And lastly, it is by definition anthropological, right?
Yeah.
You are in a setting, you are in a I don't want to call it laboratory, but that kind of, a very sterile setting. You have determined the parameters of the interaction, right?
Yeah.
And so to say, well, we're going to go do these focus groups to find out who the best messenger is to working class voters. I was at a dinner in DC about 3 weeks ago, and one of the people we were talking about this said it has a decidedly, Margaret Mead feel to it. I'm like, yeah, because you guys look at Americans like they're in a zoo.
Yeah.
Oh, look at Evelyn. She eats dinner just like we do.
Yeah.
Right. And like and like voters feel that on the other end.
Yeah, it's this huge problem of kind of the hubris of it all,
Mhm.
where the Democratic and I guess both sides, sort of the more liberal, I guess you could say, ecosystem of these consultants and pollsters, they're so out of touch with people, and they have adopted this kind of form of groupthink. I think I used to be part of this. I know you did too. Like, I
Mhm.
get it. It's very hard to see things once you're in that system and to
Right.
question them. And I think this brings me to another one of my points that I make in some of my writing, that I think there is such a profound lack of political imagination amongst uh, anyone pretty much anyone who's trying to address this crisis, right?
Right.
They're out of ideas. It's like if someone could just come along and propose, I mean, this is easier said than done, obviously. I don't know who would do it and I don't know what it would look like, but a vision for this country that isn't just this sort of technocratic groupthink, focused group um, messaging strategy. Everybody hates it, but the people who are doing it, and it's like it's. I think it deserves our scrutiny, right? Because they're also making a lot of money doing this. It's profitable. So yeah, I agree. Like maybe there's a place for this kind of focus group, it gets you something, but I think for the most part, it presumes this setting. We, the experts, are going to listen to you, the normal people, so we can go back to our glass box in DC and formulate messaging, right? And then we're going to message it to you, but we're not going to change any of the sort of structures of how we do our politics. We're not going to propose. We're not going to listen to the left, right? They're too, in these people's minds, that's too radical. That doesn't win. So they have this like idea of centrism that's not this like people think of it as kind of this like epistemological like
Yeah,
midpoint between um, like the extremes, right? It's not. It's a manufactured consensus that's at this point it has a lot like resemblance to the sort of neoliberal stuff that we've talked about
yeah,
that is broken and it needs to end, right? Like it should have died in 2008. It got revived when Obama bailed out the banks, and we're still on this train. And I think that that's kind of the writing on the wall that people don't see is that this system of neoliberalism, late liberalism, whatever you want to call it, is coming to an end. And Trump was not like a fascist import from Germany, right? He came out of what you were saying. The aberration was the 2020, not the other ones. So all
right.
these people and this kind of elite, kind of professional messaging apparatus played a role for the most part in these policies, right? And then they turn around and look at people and say, like, how dare you? You're racist. You don't want to stand up for democracy. Like, how dare you? And it's so backwards. So I think there's a lot of, yeah, I think it's important to scrutinize this. And yeah, I appreciate you
Yeah,
making
no, no.
making
Look,
room for that.
I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, the one thing for me to oversimplify, because that's the easiest thing to do, is
Hmm.
when my Democratic friends and many Democratic donors have asked me, um, why are you guys so good at messaging? And whether or not that was my time at the
Sure.
Lincoln Project or
Yeah.
as Republicans, I said because like we start from a place of belief and
Yeah.
values. What is it that we believe in? What are the values we are trying to espouse? And we go from there. We lead right on the issues. We don't, look, triangulation with the Clintons in the 90s might have worked, right? When it was a much more homogenous country, right?
Yeah.
It was a much more homogenous ideological country, right? We were, you know, Republicans and Democrats, right? I mean, there was a reason why Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton got a lot done because the truth was is that one guy was from Georgia, the other guy was from Arkansas. They both sort of had a commitment to neoliberalism, as you said, and to government efficiency, all these things we're still talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, Bill Clinton left office, Evelyn, with a 66% approval rating, right? I mean,
Well,
that's
and
out.
yeah,
Go ahead.
and I was just gonna say, I think it's because that consensus still held, right?
Right.
We had this kind of idea for what we were doing with our politics, and it held up until people would maybe argue 2008, right?
Yeah,
So
no, look,
yeah,
I think
I think
that,
that
yeah,
that's what's missing.
yeah, for me, and again, we could do a whole other show on history, but
Hmm.
it was the 2000s were really the decade of the black swans. I see it as 9/11, or actually
Yeah.
the 2000 early 2001 recession, right?
Mhm.
9/11 for me, Hurricane Katrina, which again just laid bare so much of what government couldn't do, even though that's what it
Yeah,
was supposed to
and
do.
the war, right? The war.
Yeah, and the war, yeah, with the war, right, going along two wars,
Yep.
um, and then as you said, the financial crisis, and
Yeah.
the people who caused all of these things either weren't held responsible or were enriched or both, right?
Yeah.
So now you
Exactly.
come with Obama, who like was historic, right? And you could make an
Yeah.
argument that in the wake of Bush, and I've said this before, hope and change is just make America great again in the major key,
Yeah. It's
right?
populist.
It's
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's populism. It's we're all in this together. And what happens? Obama wins Indiana. Obama
Yeah,
wins North Carolina, but the promise that he held wasn't kept,
right. He
right?
bailed out
And
the
so
banks. Yeah,
it
and he
just
gave,
became
yeah,
more of the same.
yep,
And after 8 more years of the same, then the Democrats say, we're going to spoon feed you more of the same, right?
yeah,
When,
exactly.
if you looked at it, look, and I make no, we can't say what would have been. But if you remember, you might be too young for this, Evelyn, when Bernie Sanders started his presidential campaign, it wasn't a big rally. He was literally standing under a tree on Capitol Hill with like 8 reporters, like, I'm running for president. And he was
Yeah,
at
and
like
he's been doing it ever since, right?
Right, he's been doing, but he
Yeah,
was at 4% or something. Like nobody knew who
yeah,
he was. But he
yeah,
gave Hillary Clinton a run for her money
yeah,
because he was the bizarro version of Trump for the Democrats. He was
yeah,
their populist, and you could make an argument that that matchup in 2016 would have been very, very interesting, right? Probably the most interesting campaign we've had since '92, when Ross
yeah,
Perot was really trying to inject a different worldview, one that frankly he called. If you go back and watch his stuff and read his stuff,
mhm,
like he said what was going to happen over the last 30 years. He called it lock, stock, and barrel. No one
yeah,
else was listening. A lot of Americans knew it, they felt it, right? But Ross was nuts too. That didn't help, right? But Bush and Clinton in that time, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in that time were the same people, right?
hmm,
They were degrees apart. It wasn't
right,
that different.
right, yeah. Yeah, and I think this has a lot to do with what comes next when you ask that. Um, I think it's really going to be interesting to follow, right? What happens with the establishment versus the left? Is this the moment that the left has been waiting for? I'm kind of trying to make this argument in an upcoming piece that, like, there's this void, right, that we've been talking about. There's this void where people aren't addressing these more material concerns that people have, that we should all have. Um, I mean, at least that's the perspective if you come from the left, right? And so building that moving forward, does the establishment, which I think we could put some good money that they're going to do this, they're going to take Alyssa Slotkin, someone like that, prop her up and say, go speak your populist language. She's already talked about doing this, how she's going to talk to people in Michigan and stuff like Trump does. Um, but are they going to change anything around their policies? Is it going to be just like these little tweaks to this like consensus, like we've talked about, that nobody likes and that is kind of gone? Or are they going to have any sort of introspection?
Well, I would say no to introspection. Secondly,
Yeah,
I mean, the thing about this, and you can see this with let's go back to Sanders. Like
yeah,
Bernie's been talking about this. Whether you agree with him or not, the reason why he has legitimacy with his people is because he's been saying the same thing for 70 years,
yeah,
right? Trump is is in his own way a native speaker to his
yeah,
people, if that
hmm,
makes sense.
totally.
Um, and it's why when you see whether or not it's a JD Vance or Ron DeSantis or anyone, like they're saying the same words, but it's like they're speaking through Google Translate, right? It's not the same. It's not the same thing. They're not
It's
native
kind of
speakers.
coded. Yeah,
Yeah. And here's the thing: the people that are listening all know it's BS. They know they don't believe it,
yeah,
right? And that's the sort of craziness of the wisdom of crowds is like, especially in presidential politics, like you spend enough time in Iowa or New Hampshire or South Carolina, in these places, like the one thing you can say about voters in those places, and this is not about who should be first or whatever, is like they've seen so many of these men and women, like they can pick them out almost immediately. Like, when, just as an aside, like when I saw Ron DeSantis, I knew this guy never had a chance ever. There was
yeah,
just no possible way this guy ever had a chance of being anything other than the governor of Florida, maybe a senator from Florida if that's what he wants to do. Like, he never had the ability to straddle that line between retail politics and actually standing for something, even if it's something as odious as what Donald Trump stands for, right? So
yeah,
that's one. Secondly, what I'm concerned about is that the Democrats, either by intention or by abstention, maybe that's the right way to put it, are already following what I call the Carville doctrine, which he laid out in the
yeah,
New York Times a couple of months ago, which is let it burn.
yeah.
He
Let the
said play
pendulum
possum.
swing back.
He said play possum, but it's really let it burn. Let everything
Yeah,
get so bad that the American people will come back and see us as saviors.
yeah,
Wrong. Wrong. Here's the other part. you're not talented enough to pull that off. Because here's the thing, as things burn, the Republicans will continue to blame you for them, right? Like
Yeah.
they're not going to take the blame. They never have, they never will. They're never going to, right? And so that's the other part to me, Evelyn, is that you're not offering anything new. You're not offering anything different. Just back to Alter's beginning of this, right? What did she say, right? Nobody seemed to be really saying anything at all. And so
Yeah.
you can do all the town halls you want. You can sit on the Capitol steps all you want. You can scream and carry on all you want. But the truth is that the reason why we are here in large part is because Democratic voters had it with their own party, right? Republican
Yeah.
voters show up. That's what Republicans do, right?
Well,
And that's one thing, and I promise I'll
sure.
let you. I'll stop after this. Is That's the one thing that fascinated me, Evelyn, was that every cycle, Democrats are desperate to convince their voters to show up.
Yeah.
Every single cycle. And I was always shocked by this. I'm like, I don't understand why you guys have to do this all the time. And to me, it's because they know inherently, and they're never going to say it out loud, that they haven't made the case. So they have to go beg and plead and scare year in and year out.
Yeah. What they're offering, right? It's hollow. There's really no idea of kind of what it is. It's just this kind of like elite uh, version of liberalism. But I think what's interesting to go back to JD Vance, I find this really interesting. So remember when he gave his speech at the RNC and he talked about, told the story about wanting to be buried alongside like 7 generations of his family in Kentucky. Like that, he gave this vision of the good life that involves that, not having to go to a big city, being able to live a dignified life where you're born. Um, and uh, the Harris response, remember what they said? They called it all very weird, right? He's
Mm.
so weird. Like, that's weird. What's weird to me? Like, what's weird about wanting to have a family and wanting to have a job and wanting, like, this is the language that liberalism, as they uphold it, has no, um, or sorry, these ideas that liberalism has no language for. They can't address these more spiritual questions that people have. And I argue it's like it's not just the quote unquote losers of this meritocracy, right? It's also the winners. It's the people who've gone to college, who have gotten this job in the city, and they're clinging on to it for dear life because that job provides to them their health care, their ability to have children, their time off, right? And these things that should be probably guaranteed by the state are guaranteed by your employer. And it leaves this just like state of anxiety and hollowness that I think is plaguing a lot of people, young professionals who are the Democratic voters, right? So there's a huge gap between like what the lived experience is of people who are their base, and increasingly like they made a decision, right? Read about this in like the 70s to the Democrats did to abandon working people and become this party of this kind of white
Right.
collar professional class. But if those voters are kind of going to the polls, like all my friends, like going to the polls saying, "Oh, I guess I have to do this," they're not excited about Kamala Harris, and this is the problem that I think they're just too much in this kind of like groupthink mentality of their old ways of doing things that they can't even reckon with these issues. And to me, like that's a really big problem.
So you sent me a YouTube video
Hmm.
of a guy. Is it Patrick Deneen?
Patrick Deneen, yeah,
Yeah. All right. And so, guys, we're going to get nerdy for a second. Super nerdy. So this guy is like, he's a professor at Notre Dame, very smart guy. Like,
yeah,
if you watch this video, like, it's really for nerds only, right? Like anybody can watch it, and it's an interesting conversation, but it is pretty nerdy. But the one thing that was really interesting, Evelyn, is that for a guy who sort of seems conservative, he's certainly not Trumpy conservative. He's maybe more, you know, you said he wasn't bushy, but he seems like more thoughtful on domestic stuff, which was like,
yeah. It's hard to
you
pin
know,
down.
like no, like because they're having this debate about like what it means to be governed, right?
Hmm.
And he makes the case that like to be governed maybe means you say no. I want the things you're talking about. I want some base level of security, not
Yeah,
just from the bears or
Yeah.
from the bad guys, but from some base level of security that I'm going to be able to live my life without having to worry about X, Y, and Z. And then, to get nerdy again, I just read this article in the Journal of Democracy by Francis Fukuyama from
Oh.
Stanford, who famously wrote The End of History,
Yeah.
who said that he and two of his associates posit that maybe the reason why democracy has failed is because democracy didn't deliver. And that's the same idea, which is if you go to a lot of these places, um, democracy didn't deliver, right?
Yeah.
The people who voted, right? Like they're like, and I heard this from black church leaders. My people are
Mhm.
going to do one of two things. They're going to vote for the Democrat or they're going to stay home because year in and year out, their lives don't change. And
Yep.
that I think is the failure of a post-industrial modern democracy, right? Which is we have all the money.
Yeah.
We print all the money. We can do whatever it is we choose to do, and we continue to allow or elect leaders who choose to do things that are not in our interests. They are not representative of our interests. And I was just,
Mhm.
and think about this. So there was a story out yesterday, and I just use this as an example that the Trump administration said they're going to spend $1 trillion over the next decade to upgrade our nuclear arsenal of some 5,600 warheads. I
Right.
texted a friend of mine who is an expert in these issues, not just some like random guy who has a podcast who thinks he knows them. And I'm like, do we need this many? And he wrote, no. Okay, so that means we're going to spend $100 billion a year. $100 billion a year for the next 10 years, money that we're borrowing, right? Not to upgrade water systems, refurbish schools, make sure that the education system gets kids to something of past the seventh grade reading level. No, we're going to continue to spend outrageous amounts of money we don't have on things whose only job is to end life on Earth. Does that
Yeah.
make any damn sense?
Right. And is that democratic? Like, how far is this country from being an actual democracy? Right.
Right.
So yeah. I guess I would say to go back to Patrick Janine, who you mentioned, if people are interested in this whole concept, it's very interesting stuff. He would identify as a post-liberal. So his whole argument is that he wrote a book. It's called Why Liberalism Failed. And his argument is that it basically failed because it succeeded. And liberalism in this term is not like the Democrats. It's like this kind of philosophical, classical idea of like individual rights, a free
Right.
market, institutions, right, stuff like this. Um, and so he says that it failed because it succeeded, and it created this idea that like success, and he talks about this in the talk, that people's highest ideals are like going and making money. And what does that say about sort of our society, how bankrupt it is of all this kind of more important things? So he says that like uh, freedom in that case, it makes you so you have the freedom to be free of all of the kind of commitments of life, right?
Right.
To be free of having to talk to your neighbor, be free of having to like have a family if you don't like, that's a whole other issue, but yeah. And so it's an interesting way of seeing, I guess, this reality that we all live in, but we don't necessarily know how to talk about. So yeah, I would note too, like Deneen, he comes from the right. So his solution to these things is very much, he's also like a big mentor to JD Vance, right? This is JD Vance's worldview, and this is the like quote unquote new right, what they believe. Um, their solution to a lot of this kind of crisis is to retreat to these more like hierarchical, traditional family structures.
Right.
Um, that's the problem for the left. The problem for the left, while we can sympathize with Deneen's critique, right? Like I think you and I both got a lot out of that. I'm not
Yeah.
saying you're on the left, but whatever. But we can
Well, I'm
sympathize
not
with
on the
that.
right.
Okay. Well, we can sympathize with his critique, but we don't agree with where it's going. The
Right.
problem with the left and where it's lacking in compared to the right is very intellectual about these ideas. The left, I think, has been kind of plagued by like this wokeism stuff. So they need to figure out a way to uh, articulate kind of this post-liberal pluralism. And I think that's where, if you're interested in kind of the realm of the ideas there. That's where
But
it's going to
but
be
but
interesting.
I think, yeah, I think that's one thing. That's a really good point you make, and I've said this, and I'll be a little bit crude about it. Is the thing about the American right is they'll take any crazy you have,
For their
but
power. Right?
yeah, for power. But
Yeah.
it also opens up a weird level of intellectual openness, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Which is like you and I are talking about a guy who we don't agree with, like this whole, like, monarchy and Curtis Yarvin and all this
Yeah. It's
freakiness
that
about,
stuff.
CEO monarchs and tyrants and all this
Yeah.
other stuff, right?
Feudalism. Yeah.
Um, but it does say, like, guys, the reason, like, this stuff does matter, right? Like
Yeah.
the
And there's a
being
name for
willing
this.
the being willing to have an open and honest conversation
Hmm.
about how we want to see the world, right? Which is, you have some on the left who are like, this is how I see the world, and if you don't agree with it, F you. And you
Yeah.
have another group who are like, I don't want to talk about the world. I just want to get reelected. I just need to keep the dollars flowing. I just want to keep
Yeah.
what I
I need to
have.
keep my donors happy.
Right. I need to keep the donors happy. And like, I
Yeah.
get it. Look, I mean, as someone who has to ask donors for money on an
I
almost
know.
daily
It's a
basis,
broken system. I think you blame the system, right? Yeah.
right? You don't hate the player, hate the game. But that's, I think, too, where you see a situation where, when the opportunity arises for an honest conversation
Yeah.
about where we should go and what we want the world to look like, oftentimes, what I've observed from the American left, Evelyn, is either an unwillingness to engage, or a, like, okay, let's just do what the Republicans do, but let's code it like abundance, like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, right?
We're
Which
going to go
Dave
speak to the Democrats, right?
yeah, Dave Troy called, left coded Doge. Right. And so, like,
Yeah.
it's not really different. It's
Yeah.
not, it's not anything that's going to upset any apple carts. But here's the other
Yeah.
problem too. It lacks any sort of inspiration. It lacks
Yeah.
any sort of ability to get more than like eight really wealthy people and people who already agree with you to come along. And that's the problem, is that for the guy that I spoke to, and I've talked, people have heard me talk about this, the guy I spoke to in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who was just getting home from work when I knocked on his door, like, abundance ain't his issue. It's, in
Yeah.
fact, like, he's got a house. Having a house isn't his issue, right? The problem is that it's the only house he's ever going to own, and he's probably working two wage earning jobs and just barely making it.
Yeah. 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 I think that's part of it. I think a lot of critiques on the left of the abundance stuff would say that it's kind of just a rebranded neoliberalism, right?
Well,
It
that's all it
essentially,
is.
yeah.
Because, I mean, one of the listen, I went to high school and college in Texas, so they sort of extol the virtues of, renewable energy in Texas, and, lack of
Mm,
zoning in Houston, which, if you've ever been to Houston, like, okay, it doesn't have zoning, but it's also an insane city. Like, it makes no
right.
darn sense, right? But that leaves out the idea that, yes, you have renewables, but, like, how about talking about the fact that the Texas utility grid is disconnected either from the Western or the Eastern American grids? So when it goes down, right? When it goes down, there's no backup. So when that happened a few winters ago, people froze to death,
Yeah.
right? And what happened? They didn't indict anybody at the the grid operator. No, they paid off the guys who provide the gas and the oil to power the plants, right? Like, they
Yeah.
didn't fix anything. And so for me, it's like, okay, well, is it really liberal to say, well, some old ladies in Houston got to die for the greater good, right? Like,
Right.
that to me leaves out a massive moral part of this, which is that we cannot and should not deny that morality, whether you like it or not, is a big part of politics.
And it's a big part of life, right? In a lot of ways, it's what makes our lives like meaningful, is our obligation to other people.
Right.
There's a beautiful speech, and I know we're wrap this up soon, but I'll just say, if you haven't heard David Foster Wallace give his speech, "This is Water," it's a commencement speech from the 2000s, and he talks about this. He talks about how liberalism, well, he doesn't say it in that word, but sort of he's speaking to these college graduates, right, who are going to go work these fancy jobs. And he says that if you worship money and power, he quote says, like, it'll eat you alive.
Yeah.
What's really important in life is the obligations that you have to other people, right? It's like sacrificing for them, it's building community. And we used to have, I mean, a sense of that in America. There were more institutions that fostered that. and
Right.
that could have and our politics could speak to that, but it doesn't anymore. And the liberals cannot reckon with that. They don't seem to have any sort of way to think about that. Like I said, with Harris calling what Vance was trying to do weird. There's a congresswoman in Washington State who tries to talk in these terms, so I think it's really interesting. I'm trying to write about her, um, and she talks about kind of rejecting this idea of progress in the way that the liberals promote it, like the abundant stuff, where
Yeah.
abundance would just be kind of building our way out of crisis and the most future forward stuff. She talks about like, what do I owe to my neighbor?
Right.
Can I fix the stuff that's broken? Right? Can I live a life in the place I was born? These questions that we've really lost, and I think that they're kind of coming back. You see, like this whole trad, a life, traditional life stuff coming back. People are yearning for this from, and they're not getting it from their politics. And if someone can come along and speak to that, I think they'd be very successful.
Well, I mean, this is, I mean, look, this is where also, like, you don't have to agree with how someone, like, here's the thing is you can't demand that someone 100% accede and accept the way you live your life if you're not
Yeah,
going to offer them that same thing. So if
yeah,
you choose to be X, Y, and Z, right, and you demand 100% social compliance with the way you live your life, you can't say, but the young woman who decides she wants to get married, have 3 or 4 kids, and stay home, right, is living her life incorrectly. I mean,
yeah,
because that's the flip side of the weird morality is like, it's amoral and it's overly puritanical in its own weird way at the same time. Like that's a pretty impressive feat to pull off, to be
yeah.
honest
And
with you.
it's like feminism has been co-opted by this like kind of market-based liberalism that creates, and I'm not like saying that you should have the choice, right? That's the thing. But for a lot of women who grew up in this sense that like your career was the most important thing, and you had to climb this ladder, and that's the good life, that's success, are beginning to question now, right? Why do we think that? Is that really all there is to life? So I think there's the liberals have backed themselves into a corner with that. It's the same way they talk about like DEI and stuff. It's not in terms of like building some sort of like coalition amongst marginalized people. It's about, right, like corporate policies of inclusion. And I feel like
Right.
that kind of stuff, it's very telling of like who their audience is and what they see as like valuable. And I think that, yeah, even for the left can sometimes fall into these problems of wokeism where it becomes like this litmus test of what you believe and how you speak that goes against what the goal should be, right? Is building a coalition that's based not on how what makes us the same, but what makes us different, right? That's how like successful. There's a book called Solidarity by Leah Hendricks and Astor Taylor. If people are interested in, they should read this. But it's about what real movements look like.
Well, so that's the other. So the guy that's my best man
Yeah.
um, was born in Houston. His parents are from Mexico, and he is a very plain spoken gentleman. And he said the problem with you white people is you think we're all the same.
Hmm.
He's like, we could not be more different. He's like,
Yeah.
there's no one, south of the Rio Grande, from the Rio Grande to Antarctica, that agrees on anything, right? You just think we're all brown, right?
Yeah.
And I think
It's
that's that. And to me too, that's always been. And you talk to my friends in Florida at Mi Vecino, right? Like who've done incredible work in voter registration. Um, and mi vecino means my neighbor in Spanish. And they're very understanding that, like, let's just say for argument's sake, Evelyn, there are 10 different Latino ethnicities in South Florida. There's probably more,
yeah.
right? Like, they don't send a Venezuelan into a Cuban neighborhood, right? They don't send a Puerto Rican into a Guatemalan neighborhood, right? Because they understand that they are distinct cultures. They are distinct countries, they are distinct dialects. And so, like, there's a very clear understanding that, like, no, just because somebody comes from a place that, like, where, the conquistadors once showed up, right,
Right.
in the 16 and 1700s, that now you're all the same. And, like, that's to me too, like, where the weirdness of the American left is like, wait, everybody's supposed to be different, but you're just treating them like they're all the same.
Yeah, yeah, it lacks that nuance to its own detriment, right? That's why you see like the Democrats hemorrhaging support amongst people of color, right? Uh, because they're assuming that it's like it's their moral duty to uphold like their own interests by voting for the Democrats, and that's just like such an arrogant premise for them to have. So they need to interrogate that. I mean, we've talked about this. They need to interrogate that if they want to do anything about it. But I think sort of maybe we leave it here. My If I have any hope, it's that there's a void here that can be filled
Right.
with good ideas and new ideas, right? We can acknowledge that this is broken and that an attempt to revive it will only make things worse. So you have to start offering something else. And I think that that's where the hope is. I'm not really interested in like trying to. I don't know if the Democratic Party as an institution is like worth saving, to be honest. A couple months ago, I would have given you all my communications ideas, but I've come to the point where it's like hard to see it as something that's redeemable at this point. So I think
No,
that
it's look, it's like a doctor saying, "Well, yeah, you've got this really nasty, deep-seated infection that we really need to fight, but also you have this mole that I'd like to have a look at."
yeah, let's
Right?
do that. That's more important. Yeah,
That's more important. Like, yes, the gangrene that's eating you from the inside out, it'll be fine.
yeah,
Um, but well, listen, I want to thank you, but one
yeah,
thing before you go about that, a friend of ours, someone we both used to work with, said there's a reason why the most popular word in marketing is new, right? New,
mm,
not
yeah,
old, new. There's a reason why if you're in a change election, right, that's because the people want something different. If you're a
yeah,
challenger, you want the new thing. If you're the incumbent, you want to say everything's great. But you have to be willing to understand, like, is that true? Is it not true? And here's the other part is, we can look at statistics all we want, unemployment's very low, GDP is up, the stock market's up, yada, yada, yada. But clearly, there's
yeah,
still a pretty significant rot within the country where
yeah.
it doesn't matter if the unemployment is low. If people believe that their life sucks, right, they're going to
And have
react.
good reason to believe, right?
Yeah,
Like
and yeah, right,
exactly.
and
Yeah,
have plenty of legitimate reasons to believe
yeah,
that or to feel that way,
yeah,
then that's how they're going to react. And until and unless we can provide a different, new, and countervailing argument to what Trump
yeah,
has on offer, which is chaos for its own sake is great, right? Change for its own sake is great. At least I'm doing something. They don't
yeah.
do anything. Like,
Mhm.
he is right. He is doing something. Is he doing good things? No. But here's the other part is I think we also, and this is something I think you and I talked about on the phone the other day, Evelyn, is we have to have spaces where you can have conversations in a time when like right and left don't cut cleanly anymore. Not that they ever did,
Yeah,
but they certainly don't now.
yeah, definitely. And I think we can all agree, this is like goes back a little bit to when we were talking about the post-liberal stuff. We can all sympathize with the diagnosis that the system is broken, right? Like we can all agree on that. So let's start there, right?
Right. But again, that's where I think there are a lot of people who still don't believe it. Remember
Oh,
what
well, yeah, yeah, I guess I'm talking more about like the people. How I think a lot
uh,
of people who don't work in politics completely understand this. They don't
yeah,
need
no,
to be
you're
told
right.
this, right? So it's like the
100%.
so if there's enough people in this, like you're talking to your neighbors and stuff, everybody. It's so funny. Everybody like when I'm having a conversation with someone who doesn't work in politics, this stuff is like just common sense. Like it's not like it just it comes up, and it doesn't in these kind of professional echo chamber worlds of consultants and stuff. So
Well,
yeah,
no,
I think
because that there's two things. One, you might actually have to do something about it, which they don't care because they get hired and
right,
they make money whether they win or lose. And secondly,
right,
you'd have to look in the mirror and see Dorian Gray, and they don't want to do that either. All right.
right. Okay.
This has been great, Evelyn. I hope we'll
Yes,
do it again. Before we let you go, tell folks where they can find you on Substack, if there's any other social outlets, and then where they can find your writing.
yes. Thank you so much. So I'm on Substack at Quartz Evelyn. Post most things there. I think it's the same handle for Blue Sky. I'm also on Twitter a little bit. Um, and then my writing, yeah, Substack. I have a couple pieces coming out in different outlets, which is exciting. But I'll be sure to share them on my Substack. So yeah, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Reed, for doing this. It's been great.
Yeah. Also, please, guys, sign up at the Homefront as well.
Yes.
Go check out the Homefront podcast, and I'm all over social media. So yeah, you're never not going to find me online. All right, Evelyn, thanks so much,
Thank you. Thanks,
and
everyone.
everybody else. We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye.